I greet you all and welcome you to the Manifested e-learning platform. The subject is governance and compliance audit. Today we are moving to chapter number 6, planning for a governance and compliance audit. This chapter has 16 sub-chapters, namely 1, initial considerations for planning; 2, planning process with timelines; 3, materiality at planning stage; 4, determine audit objective and scope; 5, determine the key governance and compliance parameters; 6, determining the level of assurance; 7, identifying subject matter and criteria; 8, understanding the entity and its environment; 9, developing audit strategy; 10, assessing audit risks, threats, and safeguards. Then number 11, developing audit plan, program, and procedures. Number 12, preparing of audit working papers. 13, developing governance and compliance matrix. 14, governance and compliance audit checklist. 15, quality control. And lastly, the audit team. These are 16 subchapters. We are going to take a subchapter at a time. Today we begin with the initial considerations for planning. The question is, what has to be considered at the planning stage of a governance and compliance audit? And candidates, planning for a governance and a compliance audit requires a structured and deliberate approach to ensure its effectiveness and efficiency. And the initial considerations for the planning phase are very crucial because they lay the foundation for the entire audit process. Just like anything else, candidates, if you have any project that you are to undertake, there has to be a phase where planning has to take place. Planning has to be done before any engagement. And governance and audit and compliance audit engagement is not different, because the plan lays the foundation for the entire audit process, because we know a governance and compliance audit is a long process. And before embarking on that engagement, the auditors have to have a plan. In this lesson, we are going to outline the initial considerations for planning a governance and compliance audit. And therefore, by the end of this lesson, you should be able to outline the initial considerations for planning of a governance and compliance audit. And the planning stage is about defining the what, defining the why, and defining the how the audit is to be undertaken. The what, the why, and the how the audit before any fieldwork begins. Before the auditors go to the field, there has to be a plan. And we know generally, candidates, a plan is a predetermined course of action. You determine in advance what you are going to do. So the auditors must have the plan. And the first initial consideration is defining the audit scope. The first consideration. We are outlining the initial considerations for planning. The first one is to define the audit scope and objectives. Define audit scope and audit objective. That's the first consideration. All right? The auditors must clearly establish the purpose of the audit. Okay? Is it to assess adherence to specific regulations? Is that the purpose? Or is it to evaluate the effectiveness of the company's internal control system? Is the purpose to address a past compliance issue? Or is it to prepare for what we call external certification, like the ISO. So that's the first thing to do. And that is answering the why. What is the why? What is the purpose? The why. Clearly establish the purpose. So if you are to be engaged to carry out a governance and compliance audit, make sure that is very clear with their client. Define the why. Then there is also defining the specific areas to be audited. That is now the scope. The specific areas to be audited. What is the scope? The specific areas to be audited. Because a governance and compliance audit can encompass a wide range of functions, including IT infrastructure, including information management. It could include risk management, financial operations, legal and regulatory compliance or adherence. It could also include board oversight. So there has to be a well-defined scope, which then prevents what we call scope creep. And defining the scope ensures that the audit is aligned with business priorities. So that's the first thing to do. Define the audit scope and the objectives. And that is answering the question, what is the why and what is the what? That's step number one. That's the first consideration. The second consideration is to identify applicable laws. Step number two, identify applicable laws. This could also be regulations. Identify the applicable laws, regulations, and also standards, if any, and standards. At the planning stage, it's important to determine all the relevant authorities that the organization must comply with, because we know all organizations operate in a certain legal environment. So when auditing a company, as a governance and compliance auditor, ensure that you outline or identify the laws, regulations, and standards that the organization is required to comply with. And this includes the local standards, local laws, international laws. It could also include industry-specific regulations. It could be even the organization's internal policies or corporate laws, like the company law and any legislation, and also established code of conduct. That's what has to be done at the planning stage, identifying applicable laws, regulations, and standards. And the auditors must also stay up to date with any recent changes or updates to these frameworks we are talking about, because they can significantly impact an audit. That is step number two. Step number three, conduct preliminary risk assessment. At the planning stage, it is also important to conduct a preliminary risk assessment. Here, the auditors identify the risks to compliance and also the potential impact and the likelihood of non-compliance. What is the likelihood that the company may not or will not comply with the laws? Because this then allows the audit team to prioritize areas of focus. Because if you are to, for example, carry out an audit as to whether the company is complying with laws or not, it's important that at this phase you conduct preliminary risk assessment. And that then allows the auditor to adopt a risk-based approach, which is essential. Because instead of just auditing everything, the audit team can now focus on the most critical areas where non-compliance would have the most significant impact on the organization. Conduct preliminary risk assessment. That is the third initial consideration for planning. So before you come up with a plan, first of all, conduct preliminary risk assessment. Then the fourth consideration is to assemble the audit team. Assemble the audit team and allocate resources. This is still at the planning stage. The auditor should select the audit team with the necessary knowledge and skills. And this often includes a mix of internal auditors, compliance officers, and also subject matter experts from various departments, like the IT department, the legal department, or the human resource department. The auditor then determines if an external audit firm is also necessary, particularly for certifications or when independent oversight is required. So that is the audit team. Assemble the audit team. There is also the allocation of resources. Allocate resources like time, like personnel, technology, and so on to the audit so that it can ensure that work is completed effectively. This is still at the planning stage. Identify who are the members who are going to carry out this audit. Then allocate resources. Are the resources available to ensure that the audit is completed to completion? Another consideration is to review previous audit reports. Review previous audit reports. At the planning phase, the auditor may also examine the findings of any prior audits to see if previously identified issues have been addressed. You may be called in to audit a company in 2025, and this company may have been audited by another auditor in 2024 or in 2023. So when planning is important to review the reports that are issued by the previous auditors to find out if there were any issues that were raised and if such issues were addressed by the company in relation to the governance and compliance audit. And you also need to confirm that any corrective actions or non-conformities from the last audits were investigated and remediated. You understand? Yes. Review previous audit reports before embarking on an audit. 6. Establish clear timelines and a clear communication plan. Establish clear timelines and communication plan. The auditor should develop a realistic timeline with key milestones for each stage of the audit, because an audit has various stages. We have the planning stage, field work, reporting. There is also follow-up. So there has to be timelines when these stages are completed, when these other stages are to begin. That is establishing a timeline. There is also communication plan. There has to be a communication plan which will help to keep all stakeholders informed, because that then ensures there is transparency, and it also fosters a collaborative relationship between the audit team and the audited departments. There has to be that plan. How are you going to engage with the company that you are going to audit? That has to be done in an audit plan, and that has to be communicated before the audit begins so that the company knows when the auditors will be visiting. So there is also collaboration. When information is sought from the company, that is made easier because there is communication on what is required from both the audit and the auditing client and also the governance and compliance audit team. That is initial consideration number 6. The 7th initial consideration for planning is identifying the subject matter. Identify the subject matter and audit criteria. Identify the subject matter and the audit criteria by clearly defining what is being audited. What is the audit matter? What is the subject matter? All right? Could it be the effectiveness of data privacy program? The auditor should also, at this point, identify the standard against which it will be evaluated. That is the criteria. If it is a data privacy program, then you need to look at the Data Protection Act. Is that the standard upon which the audit is going to be carried out? Because if you are to audit the effectiveness of data privacy program of a company, then there has to be a criteria. You have to look at what the company is doing against the standards that are there, against the audit, and that could be the Data Protection Act provisions of the Data Protection Act. You may be called in as a governance and compliance auditor to give a report or to evaluate or examine if the company is complying with the Data Protection Act provisions. So you look at what the company is actually doing against them. That's what we are referring to now, the subject matter, because this provides a clear framework for evidence gathering and also evaluation, which also ensures the audit findings are objective and well supported. So that's all for our today's lesson, in which we have identified the initial considerations for planning of a governance and compliance audit. These are 7 considerations. The first consideration is to define audit scope and objectivity. Number 2 is to identify applicable laws, regulations, and standards. Number 3 is to conduct preliminary risk assessment. Number 4 is to assemble the audit team and allocate resources. 5 is to review previous audit reports. Number 6 is to establish clear timelines and communication plan. Then lastly is to identify the subject matter and audit criteria. So this is what is required, candidates, if you are called upon to carry out any audit engagement. You have to consider these matters at the planning stage. And by addressing these initial considerations, the organization can create a comprehensive and effective audit plan that is aligned with its strategic goals and also provides valuable insights into its governance and compliance posture. So thank you for attending the lesson. I hope to meet you in our next session where we continue with the topic on the planning for a governance and compliance audit. Bye-bye.